Good morning. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the Restoring American Innovation project here at CSIS. It's a project which is designed to help us understand what are the foundations of our innovation system in the United States and to suggest to policymakers and the public at large measures that need to be taken to ensure that we remain competitive, that we have a prosperous economy and one that ideally positively impacts Americans everywhere. We're particularly fortunate today to have two outstanding experts. One is Dr. Chris Miller, an associate professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the author of The Chip War, this best-selling book called The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. One of the hallmarks of the RAI program at CSIS is that we speak with industry, and we're particularly pleased to have Dr. Andreas Schumacher, the Executive Vice President for Strategy, Mergers, and Acquisitions at Infineon Technologies, who has flown in from Germany to participate in this meeting. And Dr. Miller actually flew in from Boston, and we are, against all odds, he's actually here today to be with us. And we're going to talk about semiconductors. I will not venture definitions in this august company, but many people hear about a semiconductor and they ask, well, what's a semiconductor and why does it matter? Perhaps Dr. Miller would like to take that up. Chris?
Just to put some basics on the table, a semiconductor is a piece of silicon in most cases, but not exclusively, with circuits carved into it, which provide all of the computing, most of the memory, sensors, and communications capabilities that we today take for granted. And so going about our daily lives, we interact with thousands and thousands of chips in our cars, in our dishwashers, in the data centers that are storing and processing all of our data. So even though most people have never bought a chip, most people never see chips, we in fact rely on thousands of them just for our daily lives.
Yeah, I'm fond of telling the story. I remember being up on Capitol Hill with a person who was very busy talking to me and using their phone, and they said, so why are chips so important? Anyhow. Now, Dr. Schumacher, Andreas, if I may, many people talk about semiconductors as if they're just one large composite without much differentiation. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Happy to, but first of all, thank you for having me at CSIS here. And Chris provided the intro for that already. Semiconductors have sometimes been called the oil of the 21st century, and just as oil is very pervasive, comes in many different shapes and forms, so are semiconductors. And semiconductors originally were a mere humble switch, an electronic valve, so to speak, and they branched into very different directions. And perhaps we can have one graph which we prepared here. Sure. Aptly a semiconductor tree, and indeed down here below you see 1947, the first transistor, and then the development, really the innovation, took us in very many different directions. Maybe start up here on the right, still single switches, but switches which are capable of switching very high electrical powers, which you might need for the electrical grid, for example, or also in an electric vehicle. You have memory ICs which do just what it says, what they would do. Some can store the digital information as energy is being provided. Others will have to be continuously powered. We then have, of course, the microprocessors and microcontrollers, which get so much public attention nowadays. And then I'm going to be brief on the left side, all types of sensors, all the way to quantum sensors, and even the humble LED, whether it's a laser or the lighting in the room you're sitting in, that's all semiconductors. So very wide field, and a lot of room for advancement, for new materials, for new manufacturing technologies, as Chris has also outlined in his book, a fascinating and wide area.
Well, I think that's particularly interesting, is that it's not only critically important, but it's the importance is expanding across more and more applications. And Chris, you have a background in national security studies. I think it's perhaps worth mentioning, is there a national security component to this?
Well, I think there certainly is in two different ways. One is that semiconductors are used throughout the defense industrial base and throughout military and intelligence systems. And if you think of the tree that was just shown, almost every single branch on that tree is used in a typical fighter jet, for example. And so just for supplying the defense industrial base, we need many millions of semiconductors. But next to that, there's the question of where do we source our semiconductors from? And the good news is that historically the US and Europe and Japan have been the major producer of many types of semiconductors. But one of the trends over the past couple of decades is increasing sourcing from countries in East Asia. There's a concern right now about too much concentration for production of certain types of semiconductors in specific geographies. And so that's the other aspect of the national security discussion.
Well, you raise a very important point. We often talk about Taiwan, and we should come back to that, but there's also sometimes some confusion when we say that we make only 11 or 12% of the chips now within U.S. borders. But correct me if I'm wrong, a counterpoint to that is that about 47% of the chips are made by American companies, headquartered in the United States. And many of those are the most advanced chips. The foundry model that Morris Chang developed has transformed the industry. But at the same time, on the design side, I think it's worth pointing out, we remain very strong, do we not?
Well, that's right. And I think that's why we need to look across the entire supply chain, from the design software to the tooling that's used to make chips, all the way through design and manufacturing. It's not right solely to focus on manufacturing and ask what percentage are made here or there. You need to think about your entire supply chain, which means materials and software and tools. And across the supply chain, the U.S. does remain very strong. And U.S. firms, as you mentioned, are major players in many types of chips. And so we do need to think holistically about the industry rather than fixating just on which chip is made where. That's only part of the story.
Well, one point, there's been a lot of effort to try to reshore things, although how much of the percentage-wise of the supply will be actually reshored, I think is an open question. I'd like to hear your views. But when we spoke previously, Chris, I think you had emphasized the interdependence of the global supply chain. Could you perhaps address that a little more detail?
Well, I think that is a key point, because today for a typical chip, it will be produced using inputs from a dozen countries, crossing borders many different times, from the software that's used to design it, to the materials that are used, whether mined versus processed or refined. There's no country that is anywhere close to self-sufficient in semiconductors. And that's been critical because the advances we've seen have depended on extraordinary specialization, which has been a good thing. And so the challenge we face now as we think about our supply chains resilient is to keep all the innovation advantages of specialization, but to nevertheless de-risk where there are concerns about over-concentration. And that's the balance that we're trying to strike right now.
Right. Well, the de-risking the over-concentration seems like a good plan. One of the things that I'd be interested in your views, Andreas, is we talk a lot about geopolitical concerns, but I've been often more concerned about the earthquake gods. Could you perhaps address that?
Well, you hinted at that. It just so happens that when it comes to those semiconductors, which at the tree you saw at the very top, these graphic processing units, microprocessing units, which are so instrumental for example, teaching artificial intelligence systems, those are predominantly made in Taiwan. In fact, I believe that TSMC, or Taiwanese companies, mostly TSMC, have a share of the production of about 90% of those type of semiconductors. And yes, as you point out, geopolitics notwithstanding, there are other factors which can impact the supply chain. You can have power outages, which a few years ago were an issue even in the United States. You had fires, unfortunate events. And so having a resilient supply base, which does not rely on one country or even one location would be particularly important for those critical semiconductors where you really can't go without, perhaps less so for more commoditized product.
I think those are two important points here that are inherent. But first, let me ask you a general question. There have been a lot of activities with export controls, which is not the primary focus of this discussion, but and a lot more national policy attention devoted to the chip sector. Where do you see the sector now as a result of this attention? Are we making progress, or are we running risks that we may harm this finely tuned machine that we have across the globe?
Well, I think that the industry has been impacted in a very big way by the geopolitical dynamics that you've alluded to. And the finely tuned machine that we've inherited 10 years ago is just going to have to change. It is changing given the new trade dynamics and geopolitical concerns. And so I think the challenge for policymakers in the United States, in Europe, and Japan, and elsewhere is to help the industry find a new balance and make sure that the steps they're taking are supporting that effort rather than harming it. And it is complex because the supply chain itself is so complicated, and because policymakers in most cases are coming to the issue, doing their best, but there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of information asymmetries between the private sector and the public sector. And so I think governments are finding themselves struggling to keep up with both the rate of change in the industry and just the complexity that they haven't really had to get a handle on until quite recently.
Well, particularly with the supply chains, as the government tries to get to know more. One analyst that works here with the RAI program points out that companies are very reluctant to talk in detail about their supply chain. And that may be in part because they don't necessarily know that as you go down each tier, it truly is an integrated global system, and there's not necessarily an inventory book of where everything comes from, and certainly not a public one. But with this focus, I wonder if we could see that tree again, if that would be possible. Because you raised a number of important points there, Andreas. There's been all this, what I want to show is at the top of the tree there is the smallest nano levels where there's been all this discussion. But the virtue is if you look at the tree as a whole, there are many other chips, many other applications. And there's been an awful lot of talk about the lowest nanoscale chips for artificial intelligence. But when you look at the rest of the tree, this is what runs the economy. And, are we paying enough attention to these ubiquitous microprocessors?
First of all, I think the amount of attention which the general public and policymakers have devoted to semiconductors have risen probably as fast as semiconductor production has over the last year. So there's been a tremendous interest. I would agree with your premise that a large amount has been focused on those what are dubbed as advanced semiconductors, and whether that's the best description or not is a different question. It kind of stuck. But what you alluded to, yes, we have at the top of that tree those microprocessors, and I mentioned that many of them are, or most of them are manufactured in Taiwan at TSMC. And the reason why they have become so prominent in political discussions is because the U.S. government has decided, Jake Sullivan has labeled them as force multipliers, and has declared that the United States want to maintain a lead as large as possible in this type of technology, with the understanding that they can be used to train artificial intelligence systems. They can be used for maybe computational fluid dynamics, if I can digress for a second, which is useful if you want to design weapons or fighter airplanes. And so, yes, that is an area which has received a lot of attention, and a small yard with a high fence was built around those. And because the discussion has been so focused, perhaps a little bit less focus on the other branches of that tree. And whether that's good or not, I don't want to judge, but that is, I think, what happened.
Well, there has been some talk about perhaps extending these controls farther down the tree, if I could use that. And there's been, in many circles, some hesitation about the advisability of that. Chris, you had an article in the Financial Times recently taking that up. Could you elaborate on your views there?
Well, I think there's been a lot of interest in export controls in Washington and Tokyo and some European capitals in an effort to try to hold Chinese companies back from making technological progress. But the key question is, where will controls be effective? If you impose controls, you want to know if they're going to work. And what you find is that the really high end, the most capable tools, there's a very small number of companies that can produce them. As you get into older generation tools, the number of companies that can produce them is broader, and so it's harder to enforce controls. And so the simple question of will controls work at lower levels of precision needed, the answer is it gets much more complex because you've got a broader set of suppliers. And I think that has led policymakers to hesitate about expanding controls beyond their current pretty narrow focus, because there's a perception that they might end up hurting Western firms, but not actually holding Chinese competitors back if they can find domestic suppliers.
Well, I think you made that point that actually where China cannot produce the lowest nodes now, they're actively producing many of the higher nodes. Is that correct, Andreas?
Yeah, broadly speaking, that is correct. The technology to produce some of those smallest node size chips are widely available in various countries, and China amongst them. That is correct. And so the question as to whether export controls in this area would be effective indeed is a very valid one, I would say.
Well, there's a related point that was raised in our discussion a few minutes ago, and as you indicated, demand is rising very rapidly. I understand semiconductor demand overall is increasing about 10% per annum, something like that. And there's a related question is, do we actually want to constrain supply given that demand is rising?
Yeah, I mean, there now we open a much wider area for discussion. Just to briefly maybe go back to Chris's point, if we look at very specialized products and semiconductors, which could be seen as force multipliers, then having a national security perspective in the very narrow sense on those, and really making sure that those are not available to countries which the US would consider adversaries, I think is a very reasonable approach. If we are talking about a product which is in general needed to run the economy, the proverbial toaster or washing machine, the discussion becomes a very different one. Then we get into the question of economic security, perhaps, or really just into the question of free trade and whether that's more beneficial or less beneficial. So a very different type of discussion, a very different type of tool sets which would presumably work in this area.
Well, I think that's an important point, that this is both broader and more complex, and there's not just one gate to close. If I may use that analogy, there's a whole field they're going to be trying to rope in, and that's going to be much more complicated. And again, to test your views on this, one of the things I've read is that if the demand rises as fast as some experts think it will, we will be looking for supplies rather than wanting to. And again, this is for your views. My understanding, we always talked about the pandemic as disrupting the supply chains, but your analysis, Chris, suggests that actually the supply chains did okay. There were problems, but not necessarily for semiconductors, which are pretty lightweight things to move around. But there was a misunderstanding of demand. Could you elaborate on that briefly?
I think this is a really important point when we look back to the pandemic era shortages, is that actually chip production globally increased every single year of the pandemic. We produced more chips globally in 2020 despite the pandemic than in 2019. But because demand moved in unexpected ways, more people bought new computers, for example, because they were working from home, there were unexpected shifts in supply and demand patterns. And that led to shortages in very specific customer basis. So, for example, auto firms faced very severe shortages. And I think in a lot of ways, what we saw in the pandemic was not a chip shortage really, but was an auto-driven shortage, because it was really the auto customers that were struggling to project their demand, understandably. Who knew what car demand was going to be in the pandemic? And simultaneously, we're in the midst of a big secular shift where they were using a lot more semiconductors than before. And that's been a big trend in autos over the past decade or so. And that was actually one of the primary drivers of disruption in the economy due to chip shortages, was in the auto sector, unique auto demands. And I think that speaks to a broader point, which is that we can talk about semiconductors writ large, but it actually doesn't make that much sense to talk about semiconductor demand in aggregate or semiconductor supply in aggregate, because every type is different.
Yes, exactly.
And different plants will produce different types of chips, different customers will buy different types of chips. And so we've actually got to get pretty granular to start making sense of what supply and demand looks like.
Yes, I think when we're trying to look at national security, we maybe don't want to cut off the supply of dishwashers.
But I think this, Chuck, if I may, provides a very good opening for how we could think about the criticality of semiconductors from a policy perspective. You have the ones we now talked about a few times, which you really don't want to let an adversary have their hands on, and that has been the case in technology, in innovation for many, many years. Not semiconductors, but maybe 50 years ago, those were nuclear weapons, right? That's a very special type of animal, and for those export controls and export control regimes were designed, and they work more or less well. Then you might have a second class of semiconductors, really, where you say, well, we know those are available in the worldwide market. They can be built in the US, in Europe, in Japan, in Singapore. And we need them for what we would consider critical systems, maybe a hospital power supply or the energy grid more broadly. And we would rather buy them from somewhere where we know that nobody has tampered with. So that's, even though the availability is larger, we want to make sure what we buy and what we use. And that one could think of maybe as the second category from a policy perspective. And then there is the category which really is governed by supply and demand, the toaster, the washing machine, which can break or cannot work for a day, and it won't harm the overall economy. And there again, we would think about a different type of tool set, classical trade tools, perhaps to apply to make sure that our companies, our economy is balanced and is on a level playing field in an international competition. So perhaps this three bucket approach to thinking about the policy implications is helpful for the discussion.
I think those are excellent categories personally, and you might want to elaborate perhaps a little more on your second category, where like-minded countries or where have their own production, where there can be some confidence. We read recently that our friends in China apparently have plans to do some serious hacking on the infrastructure in the United States in the event of hostilities of one form or another. And perhaps you could mention or elaborate a little bit on the type of security that would be in that category.
Yeah, I mean, Chris actually has made this point very eloquently in an article last week. I think what it amounts to is to identifying what governments, what societies, or what companies, for that matter, would define as a critical electronic system, which has somehow a larger impact on how our society, how our economy functions, and then identify what type of requirements those companies or the government would have to be for the origin of the chips. And in fact, the 2023 National Defense Authorization Act contains such a clause where it requests that for certain type of military systems, of communication systems, semiconductors to be not sourced from a certain source. So it's done the other way around, very narrowly, very targeted, which might be an advisable way to do that on a policy perspective. One could think about expanding that, of course, and the fine-tuning where it becomes maybe a matter of policy and balancing that with the trade and the availability of products is then really how you define those critical electronic systems, whether those would be too broad or whether those would be too narrow. But that is indeed an approach which could be used, which is still fairly narrow and wouldn't touch the broader market of semiconductors.
That's very interesting, and I think that takes us to a point that maybe one step back, that these chips are used across the economy, but in policy discussions here in Washington, I'm sometimes troubled when people talk about legacy chips, and you get the feeling that they're talking about that it's something that your grandmother sells out of her attic, rather than some of the most advanced chips in the world. Could you speak to that, perhaps? I mean, just the rate of innovation, the expense that is involved, and the versatility of the different types of chips that are. My point is, I think the category has both an implicit disparagement, which all they do is run our weapon systems and our banking systems and our water systems and our power systems. But but do you get the feeling that there is a growing recognition of just how important these are? Mm-hmm. And implicit in that, Chris, for you is, do you think the CHIPS Act is devoting the resources that are necessary for this sector to continue to advance as well? I mean,
So, if I guess I could make the argument best if we get the tree back, this figure 1, yeah. but as wonderful here.
Great.
Yes. So again, and we've said that a number of times. It just happened, and you could call it a recent history, that the semiconductors up on the top of this middle branch, those have been labeled advanced, and that is certainly an apt characterization. But implicitly, then everything which was not up there on that tree turned out to be legacy or mature, and what we now try to do also in this discussion, in the title of this talk, we try to convince the world that the word foundational might be more apt, because they are, in a sense, the foundations of our economies. And yes, in the middle you find advancement by making the structures smaller and smaller, because that's what the number 2 nanometers means. It means that the smallest structure sizes on this device are on the order of 7 or 2 nanometers. And maybe I just point out that putting 3 gold atoms next to each other takes about 1 nanometer. So we are truly at an atomic scale for a process which requires 24/7, 365-day manufacturing around the clock in hugely complex factories. This branch. If we look at those power semiconductors down on the right, as we transition our economies to a decarbonized world, that economy will by and large run on electricity which is generated in a renewable way, hopefully, and then transmitted. It'll be converted from alternating current to direct current and back and forth again. And each time that happens, I want to have that done as efficiently as possible. I'd rather have a semiconductor switch which is 3% more efficient than have a battery which is 3% larger in a car and be able to drive my car for 10, 20, 30 miles further. So advancement in all of those different branches. Or take quantum sensors, which really go down to the very foundational principles of physics, which they explore to detect minute changes in location in space, for example, tiny magnetic fields. That's all truly advanced research. Some of it indigenous only to the United States or Europe, some of it already available in other parts of the world. So again, what Chris said before, we're looking at a fairly complex world. Supply and demand can't be spoken about in aggregate, and it requires a very precise application of policies, both to promote the industry, if that is the goal, but also then to protect the industry, if that's where we want to go.
Well, I think simply the point you make there very well is simply the importance of them and the fact that they are truly advanced chips. That it's simply a different measurement, and I do. Well, some people think here in Washington that we have kind of a nano fixation these days, where everyone wants the smallest possible, and that really disregards much of the rest of the tree. We're not trying to get out of quantum, and we're trying to get in, and that's the path. And we're trying to get into an to meet the climate challenge, and those chips are the path to do that.
Right. It's and at the risk of being a little bit too simplistic about it, just like we don't all want to buy only cars which run at 180 or 200 miles per hour, even though the most advanced cars by some metric would do that. We also want safe cars, or we want maybe electric cars, we want gasoline operated cars, we want cars with a good gas mileage. So there's not the best car per se, and only by having the best car we can make sure that our economy, our national security or other systems are best served. It's really the mix of all of that.
Well, and all those attributes are won by having more modern, more efficient, lower energy use chips. And that's I think we have, and that gets back to the broader policy question. I think in the CHIPS Act, there's $2 billion for the microelectronics commons, which in my understanding, which can easily be corrected, I mean, that's in defense, and that's not always clear where they're going or when. Indeed, there's not much clear on where we're going to actually put these funds. But one of the questions I have, are we spending enough policy attention and putting enough resources into this area?
Well, I think in the U.S. with the CHIPS Act, which is being implemented right now, and I think in the next couple of months we're going to know a lot more about where the money is going to be spent. What the Commerce Department has already said publicly is that they're going to fund both foundational and leading edge facilities. Leading edge are often more expensive, and so we shouldn't be surprised to see a larger dollar value going in that direction, just because the facilities often cost a bit more. But I think there has been a fair amount of focus from Congress in understanding the importance of foundational, in part because in the last couple of years, there were manufacturers in the auto industry and elsewhere who were calling up their members of Congress saying, we can't get the chips that we need, this is an important issue. And that has helped to sensitize people about the significance. But I do worry that, you're right, Chuck, in saying that there's a bit of a nano fixation. Obviously, AI is critically important. GPUs, which are the chips that train AI systems, hugely important, but they're not enough. You do need the rest of the foundational base, and I think that is one of the areas of increasing focus right now as policymakers are coming to realize that there is a lot of competition internationally in this segment, and there's a need to make sure we've got the resilience in our supply chains that we used to have, and we think we still have and want to keep having in the future.
And if I could just pick up from what Chris said, because the situation in Europe is not so different from what you just described. There has been the European Chip Act, which has funded and supported the semiconductor industry a great deal. Also, it allows for support of what was called first-of-a-kind manufacturing, which is broad. At the same time, though, also in Europe, a bit of a degree with the smallest node sizes. And I think as we now go forward, governments, nations need to think about how we go through this initial investment into perhaps a more sustainable mode going forward. And with resources being scarce, government budgets being scarce in Europe, in the US, and other places of the world, I think for the next 5-10 years or so, the big question will be, do all governments want to fund the same type of semiconductor industry, or should we move to a more differentiated mode where allies work together and strengthen the respective strength? And as you have said before, in the United States, there are different strengths when it comes to pre-existing innovation ecosystems, pre-existing semiconductor companies. In Europe, companies are focusing on different types of semiconductors, and that's not better or worse. works. Both types are profitable, but both led to prosperous ecosystems. The consideration going forward, in my view, would then have to be, how do you build something which is holistically complete to the extent, as Chris also alluded to, this complex value chain, and at the same time doesn't double up everything in the United States, in Europe, in Japan, in South Korea.
Well, you raise a very interesting set of questions there. One is the coordination, and the other is ongoing efforts of support. And first, on the coordination, Chris, do you think that these different countries with different interests and different industrial orientations and capabilities can coordinate? And something I've learned from experience in the government is, if they can, is it worth it? Sometimes the frictional costs of, underneath coordination means who gets to do what. We've heard, I would ask your opinions, often people say that, some of our European friends say we don't need to duplicate. But one of the strengths of the American university system is that we give multiple awards to multiple universities to work on similar or identical topics, because we don't know who's going to succeed, and indeed there can be multiple paths to success, and that's been one of our strengths. So it's, in my academic experience, avoiding duplication means stopping the other guy's work. What is your take on that?
I think that dilemma does apply here as well. I think in principle, all of the key governments we're talking about, US, Europe, Japan, agree that coordination is desirable, and coordination is happening. The question, as you say, is that everyone would like as much investment as possible in their country for both good reasons and also for domestic political reasons that are sometimes less positive in aggregate. I think there's agreement that governments don't want companies playing them off each other to see who gives the most subsidies to build in their region. But I think a bit of that does happen because it is complex to coordinate between different geographies. I think where there's more scope for coordination is between the G7 plus Korea, about what their policy should be vis-a-vis China. Because when we talk about government support for the chip industry, it's China that's actually spending, roughly speaking, as much as the rest of the world combined, when you add up all the different types of subsidies. And there I think you do see an alignment of at least diagnosing the problem between the US, Europe, and Japan. And discussions are underway about what, if anything, should be done. But I think in all of the G7 countries, there's not a desire to see Chinese firms win a lot more market share, driven primarily by state subsidies.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and it leads to the second question, both in terms of the scope of the support that we have, the level of support that we have, and the duration of the support that we have. And I'd be interested in, to the extent that you, as representing a private company, can discuss that. I mean, one of the fears we have here in Washington in the RA program is this one and done idea. And I'd be interested in, how do you see this evolving, and what would you recommend that we do? Chris, you can.
Well, I think if you do look at this in international context, what you've got to realize is that in the US, the CHIPS Act is not the start of the industrial policy debate. It's actually a response to other countries' industrial policies.
Exactly. Well said.
And that really is critical, because the option isn't do nothing and keep the status quo. If you do nothing, the status quo changes because other countries are competing too. And I think that has really shaped how Congress is thinking about the issue. Congress doesn't normally vote to allocate funds and tax credits to profitable industries. But it's doing so now because there's an accurate sense that if Congress doesn't help, there will be strong incentives to invest elsewhere rather than in the United States. There's a great OECD study done in 2019 which found that there were US firms that were receiving more money in subsidies from other governments than from the United States. And it doesn't take a PhD in economics to guess where those companies are going to invest. And that's the challenge. A level playing field sounds great in theory. it's unfortunately a fantasy in practice. And so you've got to craft your policy with that real world view in mind. And I think that's what's driving the CHIPS Act in the United States, probably also in Europe and Japan. And I think that's what will probably have policymakers start thinking about what's next after that.
Well, I think you've just given a very effective description of what we are focused on here in the CIS program. What is particularly the challenge is the ongoing element, whether, some people have talked about CHIPS 2.0. That may be premature before awards are made. But how do you see this? Do you think Europe understands this is going to be an ongoing, or should be an ongoing effort? Do you think the resources are adequate to the task?
You're asking a lot for me to tell you whether I think what Europe thinks is appropriate. No, but joking aside, the European CHIPS Act has put two very pertinent aspects into its foundation. We refer to them as pillars. The pillar one is more focused on R&D, on innovation. The pillar two is from lab to fab. So how do you get this actually into production? And as we are thinking now about how to bring a viable semiconductor ecosystem to life, or improve on it in the G7 countries, Europe and the US, I think it is the right thing to focus on aspects which will make us longer term competitive. And that is investment in people, in universities, in STEM education. And I would argue there is also a large collateral benefit to do that under the headline of semiconductors, because if you give students better incentives to study STEMs, to become electrical engineers, physicists, programmers, those will be very interesting professions, very sought after professions in other areas as well. So focus on R&D going forward, on innovation ecosystems in the respective countries, in the respective regions, so that semiconductor industries don't live in isolation. Just a fab somewhere on a field is not going to deliver the benefit or the same benefit as a fab which is part of a university ecosystem, of a downstream supplier ecosystem, and all these things will play out now going forward even more so than they did in the past.
I think that's very well said. The connections with the universities is something that has not been fully understood, but there's also a quick question. This is related to the broader question of talent and the talent stream. I'd like to get your views on that. But these partnerships that you mentioned here implicitly between universities and companies, one of the strengths in the UN system and the US system is, Chris, I would test this on you, is that our companies do partner with universities, and our universities work on industry relevant things. And I wonder if many European universities do that as well. I think Germany is perhaps one of the best, but how do you see that evolving? Because leaving them in their separate pillars doesn't seem to be a path to success.
No, I think that's right. And if you look historically across the industry's last 75 years, you see really close correlations between advances in university research and advances in industry. I think that the challenge is that might have been a US specialty 50 years ago, but everyone else has caught on now too. And so you see the same type of system in Taiwan and in Korea and elsewhere. And so it's not enough just to say we've got a great university ecosystem, therefore we will have a great industry. It's a precondition, but it's necessary, but not sufficient. So I think the CHIPS Act is going to be focusing on improving the lab to fab transition. So for example, if you're a university researcher and have a great idea, how do you actually put that on silicon? It's actually a complex and often expensive process, and so making it easier to do is going to be really important in making sure we've got more good ideas ending up closer to industry, where industry can then pick them up and say, here's how we bring this to a commercial market.
Well, I understand that I don't know whether it's a requirement, but there's some discussion that they will, when funding is granted to some of these manufacturing facilities, that part of the quid pro quo would be to help with prototyping. Of course, the foundries, and Global Foundries comes to mind here in the U.S., but also perhaps most of all New York Creates, where they're designed to be able to do prototyping. But as you point out, someone needs to help pay for that. You know, if you're a fledgling company and all you need is a couple of $1 million to test your chip, it's, well, where do you get the couple $1 million?
When it's gotten so complex that I know professors of electrical engineering who will design chips and then just decide not to fab anything because it's just too hard, not worth their time, requires all sorts of complex intellectual property negotiations just to get the PDK, the process design kit for doing so. I think it's a real challenge. And, you know, if you look historically, you'll find that a lot of the Defense Department and DARPA-funded programs in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that were doing exactly this, the lab to fab, were critically important in making it possible to prototype more ideas. And it's just gotten harder and more expensive over the past couple of decades. And it's where we need to really focus, I think, quite intensively to make that easier.
And perhaps in this area, it might be worth looking to Europe for some inspiration. We have in Germany, we have the Fraunhofer Society, we have IMEC in Belgium, we have LETI in France, just to name a few, which over the decades have amassed quite a good track record in doing what we just described. They will use the opportunity of the CHIPS Act funding and of the importance of semiconductors to step up going forward. So again, I think there is also, if we look at transatlantic cooperation, there is room to do cooperation on research in general, or research and innovation in semiconductors.
Well, yes. I mean, you participated in the conference we had in Brussels on December 12th, and one of the themes of that was that there is at the political level, people are promising cooperation. At the middle level, they're quite hesitant, it seems to be, in officialdom. But the cooperative research organizations that you've just mentioned are all actively cooperating with New York and IMEC and LETI and Fraunhofer, and in some very significant ways.
Yeah.
It's interesting that while the policy people debate it, the operational people are doing it. And I think that's Dr. Shiva Kumar's program here has been very much focused on encouraging that mentality. I'm not sure, and just a challenge question, I'm not sure all the European universities would, you know, certainly in Gothenburg or in TUM in Munich or the Catholic University of Leuven, you know, and of course Cambridge, they're outstanding cooperative universities with many partnerships. But many universities in Europe don't seem to have that willingness to cooperate as much. The Fraunhofer system is exceptional. The French Carnot system has encouraged more by providing funding. But what would your reaction be as someone who's lived in that? I think there's substantially more progress to be made.
Difficult for me to opine in an area which is a little bit in the adjacency of what I do now daily. I had the pleasure and privilege to work not only at a university in Karlsruhe Institute of Technology, as it's now called, but also in a department which was very, very open with the generous support of the German government. I could study in the US and do some rather applied work on semiconductors, and then went back and applied that in private industry. So I'm probably the wrong person to ask for a critical view on that. But yeah, I suppose all models to some extent have their place. If you look at it from, again, the overall perspective, this goal of bringing lab research to the factories and ultimately to the economy, that is a theme which needs to be strengthened as semiconductors become more important for our societies.
Well, Andreas, on part of that, I think, is the ASML model, which is not a model but a new initiative to work very closely with the University of Eindhoven and put in really substantial funding, may be the path forward on some of these things. The idea you find sometimes in Europe is that the state pays for the university, so that's all that needs to be done. The state does the university. And one of the models here, de facto models, is that no, actually the companies participate very actively, and interestingly, often foreign companies. But that brings a really important part, the talent question. And as we expand this capacity, do we have a talent pipeline that can meet the needs? And I would be interested in both a European view and your view, a global one, but one that focuses on what we're doing. And related to that, as you know, there's been, at the upper levels of our government, an effort to cooperate more closely with India, and I think that's on both Europe and the US. Could you elaborate on how you see that? You've been to India recently.
Well, I think on talent, at the outset, I would say that if you look at the U.S. ecosystem compared to the rest of the world, across the supply chain, I think you'd say the U.S. has a talent ecosystem second to none. But there are specific nodes in the supply chain where there's been less investment in the United States over the last 10 or 20 years, and therefore there are certain specialty skill sets where there is a shortage right now. If you look at all the fabs being built in the United States, people often think what we need are more PhDs in material science. But actually, when you talk to companies, they're interested in specialty welding. That's one of the choke points right now. And it's a skill set that is certainly buildable in the United States, but you only build it if you have sustained investment in that sphere. That's why there are more specialty welders in Taiwan and in the United States, because they've been building more fabs than in the United States. And so this is a solvable problem. But I think if your mindset is we're going to build a small number of fabs a decade, you're going to guarantee that you have higher costs and you have labor shortages in these critical spheres because you're not producing the number of workers that you need in a sustained fashion. And so one of my hopes is that as investment does ramp up in the United States, and I think similar dynamics are play in Europe, is that you actually have more sustainable pipelines for people to build careers in these specialty areas. And I think if you look at the United States landscape right now, you see a lot of companies investing in new programs with universities, whether it's Purdue or Arizona State. You can go across the country and find new semiconductor engineering programs being set up. And I think that's very promising. But that does stand next to the second part of your question, which is having international talent linkages. And I would just say, from my study of the history, from the founding of Fairchild Semiconductor, which was founded by 6 native-born Americans and 2 immigrants, there has been a central role of immigrants in U.S. industry, and it is one of America's comparative advantages. The United States has succeeded over the last century by stripping its adversaries of their smartest minds and bringing them to the United States. And I think that has got to be at the center of our strategy today. And I worry, talking to companies in the United States, the amount of time they spend trying to find additional H-1B visa slots is just mind-boggling. And I think when you look at our perspective globally, we've got to be thinking, how do we attract as many smart people as possible in the United States, both because that will fill the short-term shortages, but also that will produce the base of long-run success. And certainly that's been the trend historically.
And I would, of course, if I may, vehemently disagree with you in your attempt to bring the brightest and smartest to the United States, and would want to pitch in a little bit for Europe here. But of course, for the obvious reason, because I think this discussion now comes to a perhaps underappreciated core of what policies can do to bring these important semiconductors into our economy, and that is to bring talents into the economy and have a welcoming immigration culture, which brings the brightest minds also to Europe, of course. Because I do think in Europe we have one great advantage in our education system. Certainly in Germany we do, which is that university education, even at the very, very top, by and large is still free if you compare it to the United States. So the idea of that being a huge asset for Germany, and then keeping those talents from all over the world who study in Germany, not letting them go back, but providing them an environment which is welcoming, which embraces that diversity and the skills they bring. I think that is at once so easy and so hard, but very much at the core of what we're discussing today.
Well, I would just suggest the verbs. Maybe I don't think we're trying to keep people here, but welcome them here. We're not stripping people. We're giving them opportunities. That's how we all got here. But I think, Chris, would you agree that our current immigration system is wildly dysfunctional and potentially critically so. I mean, the current restrictions suggest that if we can't bring Indian engineers here, there's every prospect of the work going to India, which has its advantages, not least for India, but also for cost structures. But I wonder if you think there's any possibility. One of the many great things in your book is you talk about the national security implications of all this. And sadly, in this capital, to get anything done, you need to wrap it in a flag. And what would you think of the possibility of a national security exemption for well-trained engineers?
I think there is interest in that, both the administration and on Capitol Hill. There have been discussions about whether you could have even a semiconductor-focused exemption.
Right.
On the rationale that if we're going to spend public funds incentivizing manufacturing in this critical industry, we want to make sure it's being done as efficiently as possible. It will require, I think, congressional action to be meaningful. But I think this is something that could find bipartisan support if it's crafted in the right way. It's not on the horizon yet, but I think there are enough people in Congress thinking about it that it's not impossible.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear, actually, because it's the elephant in the room, really. As you say, we're spending the money, and the question. There's also, we haven't touched on the technicians, which fortunately there are programs like the National Institute of Innovation Technology that is focused on training with stackable skill sets and certificates of skills. And Arizona State is doing some very interesting things on that. In fact, the flip side of the innovation in the industry seems to be, in part, the need for very innovative institutions like New York Creates, like Arizona State, like Purdue, and of course Eindhoven and Leuven, and I would think TUM. I don't know whether you would agree. But
yeah, and don't forget, again, speaking for Germany, which I know best, the classical vocational training systems, which I believe are widely recognized in the world as something enviable. So that really, as Chris said before, it's not only the university programs, but it is really a wide range of jobs. Welding technicians is a very nice example, which will be brought up to meaningful occupation, to a very future-proof occupation in this industry.
Well, you raise a very good point to conclude on. One of the New York was consciously modeled on the Fraunhofer system. The Manufacturing USA was consciously modeled on, although without the funding level required. But the theme of learning from each other, learning from others, and recognizing that there are models that need to be, is perhaps one of the most encouraging things that we can use here with like-minded countries to pay attention to what needs to be done. Interestingly, Asia, I would argue, Chris, has done well by learning what we do and doing it on steroids. In closing, I'd just like to thank you both for your time, for a very interesting discussion. I'd like to thank the director of the RIA program, Dr. Sujay Shivakumar, who has put together an incredible team that it's a pleasure to work with, and an opportunity to work with people like yourselves. I hope you'll continue the good work, Chris. I don't know if you've got your second book underway, but we're certainly not done here. And I think getting the understanding of this long-term effort is one that we really need to hold tightly on. So thank you for your time. Thanks for managing to get here with your schedules.
Thank you.
And it's a pleasure to have had you here at CSIS.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good day.